Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming on. I am Tony Gale, and I'm about to do part 3 of our 4-part portrait series. I'm a Sony Artisan of Imagery. I'm also a BenQ ambassador and Manfrotto ambassador in X-Rite Colorado, just in case any of those come up. Before we continue, before I forget, if you have questions as they come up, you can put them in the Q&A chat if you're on Zoom, or in the chat on Facebook or Vimeo or YouTube, and hopefully those will get fed to me, and hopefully I will know the answers. I am a commercial photographer based here in New York City. Many of you have probably seen me before. I do photography for a variety of corporate, editorial, and advertising clients. Coming up, we've got a bunch of stuff. Part 4 of this, June 5th, splashes and pours with Sony speedlights, a couple lesson and critiques where I'll do a lesson on a topic, and then the following week we will critique images submitted by you guys after the talk. And then we have June 20th. I didn't remove May 8th. That's over. June 20th, we have a portrait photo walk in Central Park. Additionally, if you're interested in all things Sony and more things, after this at 3 o'clock today, Autumn Schrock is doing yoga for photographers, which I think all of us get sore and banged up now and then, so I'm sure that'll be great. Scott Robert Lim is doing cinematic weddings on May 23rd. Scott Robert Lim again is doing From Motion to Magic on May 30th, and then on July 20th, Thibault Roland is doing the Art of Black and White Photography. I'm sure they'll all be awesome. The price is certainly right. Additionally, and I go through most of this on every talk, but just in case, Alpha Universe, great resource for all things Sony and all things photography. Whether or not you shoot Sony, there's a lot of information about photography in general, how people do things, all that sort of stuff. It's just alphauniverse.com. There is also an Alpha Universe community gallery where you can create a gallery of your work if you don't have a website, or even if you do, take a look, show it to people. Get your work out there. Also, if you're interested in a specific camera or lens, the community gallery allows you to search for photos made with those tools. So here I have the drop-down menu. If you're looking at the Alpha 1, you can click on that and see what pictures are up there shot with the Alpha 1 or specific lenses or what have you. It's all free. And there's also the Alpha Universe forums. Online forums if you have questions about Sony or comments or want to share things or anything like that. Also free. It's a good community. So far, I have not seen anybody be mean, which is great and not the case for most things. And then there's the Alpha Female Facebook group. They've been doing a weekly micro grant of $500, which you can win by posting a picture based on a specific topic. You don't have to identify as female to win. It's also a good community. It's moderated. People are friendly and helpful. And currently, there's a bunch of stuff on sale, April 24th through June 2nd. So if you're watching this after June 2nd, all of this doesn't apply. There is a Sony trade-in credit. So if you take your stuff to B&H, talk to them, you would get the trade-in value of a camera plus a bonus credit depending on what you're buying. So you'd get more than just the trade-in value. For the specifics, you have to talk to them, not me. But if you're buying an Alpha 1, you can get an additional $500, for example, or the 24-105 f4, an additional $100, for example, on top of whatever the trade-in value of your gear is. And there's a bunch of stuff it applies to, a bunch of cameras, a bunch of lenses. If you're looking to upgrade or buy some new stuff, it's certainly worth looking at. All right, so today we're talking about location portraits. I've mentioned on every one of these so far why a portrait photo shoot. I think with the prevalence of AI just coming and becoming more and more, that for some people, they're creating imagery with AI rather than cameras. If that's what you want to do, that's great. But to me, a portrait is actually a picture of a specific person for a specific reason, and AI isn't great for that. So, you know, maybe you want to photograph one of your parents, for example, and create a beautiful portrait of them. I think a camera serves that better, or if you can paint a painting, maybe better than AI. So I think it's just two different categories. Like painting isn't photography, drawing isn't photography, AI isn't photography. It doesn't mean any of those things don't have value or aren't useful. They're just different. All right, so today we're going to go over what is a location shoot, a little bit about planning, a little bit about the difference between just a straight up location shoot and an environmental portrait, finding a location, permits, gear, lighting, and then we'll be done. So what is a location shoot? To me, and like anything I talk about on every one of these, somebody else is going to disagree with anything I say. And that's fine. This is how I work and what I think. If you disagree, that's fine. If someone else told you something else that's different, listen to me, listen to them, and decide whose answer you like better. So to me, a location portrait is photographing in a place that already exists where you have limited control. So last time we did studio portraiture, which is a space that you control. So nothing's there that you don't want. You control all the lighting. Everything is under your control. On a location shoot, you have limited control. Maybe you can control the lights, maybe you can't. Maybe you can move some furniture, maybe you can't, but there's stuff there. You're in a space that already exists that you're adapting to rather than adapting the space to you. So to start with, planning. So you want to do a location portrait. Why? What's the purpose of it? Are you doing it for yourself? Are you doing it for a client? Are you doing it for a friend? You want to think about why you're doing it, because all of those things are going to come into play with what you're trying to accomplish. If you're just doing it because it's cool, like sometimes I will do a portrait photo shoot just because there's a place that I think looks cool. And so the person I'm photographing specifically is less important who that is. It could be anybody who seems interesting because the space is part of what makes it cool. Maybe I'm photographing a person, a specific person for a client, then it's what the client needs is what's most important. It just depends on what you need, but you want to understand why you're doing it and what the goals are from the beginning to, I think, get the best results. Although I have found when I over plan, sometimes if I have a very, very specific idea in mind, it's often not as good as whatever I do second after I got what I had in mind done. I frequently am more happy with whatever I do when I start exploring the space and seeing what's there and playing around a little bit. Then you want to think about what gear you need and what you're going to bring. We'll talk about gear in a little bit. So first, location portraiture or environmental portraiture. What's the difference? So location portraiture, again, to me, is a person. It's a portrait of a person on location in a place, but what the place isn't necessarily relevant or specific to that person. So this is an actor I photographed in a bar for a magazine. The bar looked cool, the shot looked cool, but the bar itself had no specific relevance to the actor. He didn't own it. It wasn't the bar he went to. It was just a cool place and then a person to put in it. You know, outside in LA, a couple of actors, neither of these people where we were in LA, there's no relevance except they live in LA. Rooftop in Manhattan, LA, the old zoo. I've mentioned the old zoo in LA a lot. If you live there, it's a cool place. A Sony condo event a few years ago. So all of those people were in spaces that I thought looked cool, whether indoors or outdoors, but it had no specific relevance to them. Environmental portraiture, on the other hand, people are in an environment that is relevant to them. So this is a professor who used to teach at Cooper Union. In the office he'd been in for over 50 years. So it's his office at a university that he's been in for a long time. And so part of the story of him and his personality is the space that it's in. You can see his piles of stuff. You can see the books. You can see that it's a lived-in space. If this was not his office, it wouldn't be the same. But because it's his, it helps tell the story. This is a woman who creates jewelry and clothing with zippers. So this is her workspace. Again, it shows that she does things. You can see the scissors and the cutting board and some safety pins on there and the dress forms. Mayor of Fort Worth, Texas, in front of City Hall. The mayor in front of City Hall, there's some relevance there. This is the guy who built Salvation Mountain in California. He's since passed away. Salvation Mountain is this crazy thing he built with hay bales and paint and stucco. When I was there, I asked him, what is your favorite place on this whole thing that you built? And this was his spot. This was the spot that he thought was his favorite, what he likes the best. So that's why I photographed him here. It helps tell the story of him. He was a very religious person, a woodworker in his shop. And Pallison, former gallerist at the Photographic Center Northwest in Seattle, in the gallery. Former mayor of Baltimore in City Hall. This is a writer in her living room with her books and her things that help tell the story of her. This gentleman managed several restaurants in a Las Vegas casino. This was in one of the restaurants. So all of those are environmental portraits because the environment itself helps tell the story. It's the person plus the environment. And you combine those and you get more information about the person than if they're just standing in front of a white wall or just in some place cool that's not specific to them. So those are the two things. And you want to think about, is the picture you're making a location portrait where it doesn't matter, but it just needs to be somewhere cool or nondescript enough that it's not distracting? Or do you want something where the environment itself is part of the story? All right, so you've decided that. Now you need to find a location. So you guys may have heard of this thing called Google. It's brand new, only been around about 25 years. So if you use Google Maps, you can do a search, sure, easy. Then if you go down, Street View. So Street View is where Google Maps starts to get interesting. Looking at a map, that's great. So I put in B&H, perhaps you've heard of it. It's a good camera store. And then with Street View, I can see what it looks like in front of Google, or I'm sorry, in front of B&H. So these blue lines tell you everywhere the Google Street View cameras have gone. So here we are. Maybe I want to do a portrait of Derek or Danny or Fred in front of B&H because they work for B&H. So it's an environmental portrait because they work there. I want to get a sense of how it looks. I can take a look. I can see what it looks like. I can look down the street using Street View on Google Maps. I can move the camera around, get a sense of it. That can be very, very useful, especially if it's someplace you're not familiar with. You know, if you go to B&H all the time, you know what it looks like. If you only use it online and buy stuff and have it shipped, maybe you don't know what this front of the store looks like. And if you're going to do a portrait there, it helps to have a sense of what you're getting into. And then you've got a lot more options. So more than just streets, Prospect Park here near where I live in Brooklyn. I can zoom in. Even some of the paths and trails, they've brought their cameras. So this is one of my favorite spots in the park to do a portrait. I can just click on it. It's Wellhouse Drive. It's under Wellhouse Drive there. You can see it's sort of in the middle. I just click on a spot. It shows me what it looks like. I can move the camera around, get a sense of what the background looks like. Is it too cluttered or all of that stuff? And really, really dial in to help find a location. Really, really useful. Additionally, I mentioned these last time too for studios. There's a couple of websites called Peerspace and Splicer. I have no relationship to either one. I've used Peerspace more, but try them, don't try them. I'm putting the information out there, but whether you do or do not has no impact on me whatsoever. And I am not endorsing either one of them. So Peerspace, you can go in, you can specify, if you click on more filters, you can specify what kind of environment you're looking for. So for example, here I clicked bar. So maybe you want a location that's a bar. Maybe you want to duplicate that portrait I did of the actor. So it comes up with all these places that have bars that you can rent by the hour for a location, for a photo shoot. Shows you where they are on the map, shows you pictures. It shows you what the rate is. You can look, apartment, banquet hall. There's a lot of different things. You can specify if you want a pool or a backyard. I've used them several times. I think they're very useful. Splacer is very similar. For Splacer, I specified rooftop. There's not a ton of rooftops that were available, but I can say I'm doing a photo shoot. I want a rooftop. Here's what's available. It's a way to find a space when you don't know where that space is. Or in New York, for example, even if there's cool spaces you know of, you can't necessarily get permission to photograph there. Maybe you have that bar that you love, or you've seen that rooftop through your window that looks amazing. Maybe somebody will let you do a photograph there, and maybe they won't. So using something like this can be helpful to try and make something cool. I'm going to try and get to questions as they come in. Somebody asking, when you had the A7R2, the Alpha 7R2, what is the highest ISO you would personally not go above in order to get usable prints for clients? That's Matt on Vimeo asked that question. So as a little aside tangent, ISO and acceptable noise is such a subjective thing that it's hard for me to answer, because I have seen people say that they get too much noise at ISO 200 and people that say they can go to 12,800 and they're fine. It's such a subjective thing. You are going to get noise for sure. When I had the R2, 3200, 1600 is mostly the highest I would go, but there was a time I had to shoot something at 50,000 ISO. I think the bigger issue with deciding the maximum ISO to go to is what's going to get you the picture you need, and then back up from there. It's better to have a photo that solves the problem, that's a little noisy if it is, than to not take the picture or to have a picture that's blurry because you were afraid to go to that ISO. I've definitely had more times, not in years, but where I had a picture that was a little too blurry. There was a little bit too much motion blur because I was afraid to increase the ISO. And as a result, the shutter speed was too long. And so the picture wasn't good because there was motion blur rather than noise. Noise, if you need to, you can use, denoise software, Noise Ninja or something like that. Fixing motion blur, you can't really fix. All that said, it's such a subjective thing. I can't tell you, Matt, what to do. Try it and see what you feel like. For me, 1600, 3200, for the most part on the Alpha 7R2 was as high as I would go, but there's people that would go higher and there's people that wouldn't go that high. I hope that's helpful. All right, so if you're gonna rent a space on Peerspace, this is a little trailer I rented, a little camper trailer in Los Angeles to do a photo shoot. Try and think of something that's going to get you the most bang for your buck. So I had 6 models, shot inside, shot outside, rotated through people. This was just a shoot for myself, so there was no client. If there's a client, it's a little bit of a different story. But if you're starting out, or if you're doing self-assignments or test shoots, which I do a lot of, because client work isn't always the pictures that I find the most interesting, you do want to think about, there's a picture in mind, but what else can you do while you're there? If what you want is a picture in front of a brick wall and then the rest of the space is boring, maybe you need to keep looking and find a different space. This is an example of a location where the client found it. This is a writer, and this is the restaurant that he would go to all the time. So the client found the location, the client called the location and got permission for us to be there. And then we did this photo here. So maybe you're finding the location, maybe the client's finding the location, maybe you're hiring a location scout, maybe your subject is finding a location. Sometimes the people I'm photographing have a relationship with someone somewhere that can get me in that I otherwise couldn't. All right, so let's talk about permits. Do you need a permit? Maybe you don't. It depends on a lot of things. In most places, for most purposes, whether or not you need a permit depends on if it's commercial or non-commercial. The problem with that definition is that not everyone agrees on what that means. to me, non-commercial means no one's making any money. But I have photographed in LA where I've been told I have to move because I was using a light, even though it was a non-commercial shoot. And the rule was commercial or non-commercial, but because I was using a light, they just said, well, it must be commercial, even though it wasn't. So commercial, non-commercial isn't always that simple. I find often people are basing it more on the amount of gear you have rather than the reality of whether or not it's commercial or non-commercial. I see, I think it's Vinette just asked, you send a contract when getting a permission to shoot at location? It depends on the location. Usually at the very least, there's an email agreement. I certainly wouldn't rely on just a conversation with nothing in writing at all. In part because maybe you go in somewhere, it looks really cool, you talk to the owner or the manager and they say yes. Sure, you can come in Saturday morning at 10 a.m. and do a photo, and then you come in at Saturday morning at 10 a.m. and the person you talk to isn't the one who's there, and the person who is there has no idea what you're talking about and says no. So even though the person who gave you permission may have meant it, without anything in writing that you can show to the person who's there, you may not be able to actually follow through. So at the very least, an email. I don't always do a formal contract. If I'm using something like Peerspace, or if I'm using a location that's being booked for a client, everything is spelled out. If you're paying for it, all of that needs to be spelled out, both for them and for you. You know, sometimes photo shoots can be very disruptive, so you want to be clear to whoever space you're using what you're doing, and so a contract helps everybody. But sometimes it's just an email saying, yeah, sure, you can do it this day, this time, this amount of time, whatever. But something in writing I would certainly encourage you to do. And if you're doing a Peerspace or a Splacer or something, it's all part of the system. All right, so permits, maybe, maybe not. This is specific to New York City. In New York City, the New York City Film Office, Mayor's Office on Film, says productions using handheld cameras and a tripod, where everything's handheld except the tripod, and you're not using stunts or weapons or people pretending to be cops. You're not blocking streets or sidewalks. You do not need a permit. However, see, you can even see it contradicts itself because it says camera on tripod, and then it says while using a handheld camera. You can be doing all of those things and still get someone who thinks you need a permit. So sometimes you're there and a police officer comes up and tells you you need a permit and you don't, and then you have to decide how much of a fuss you want to make. I feel like every few years somebody gets arrested or ticketed for doing photos without a permit somewhere where they didn't need a permit, and then it goes to the city, and then there's a big thing, and then the police apologize. But in the meantime, someone might have gotten arrested. So if it's a situation where there's a client, you have to decide. If it's someone who can arrest you, who says you need a permit, even if they're wrong, maybe it's best to move on and just shoot somewhere else. It can be helpful to have this website booked. It's the Mayor's Office on Film. But sometimes people can have overwhelming evidence in front of them and still be wrong. So in New York City, on New York City property that's outdoors, doesn't include parks, doesn't include interiors. Oh, you know what? Actually, looking at it, the handheld thing is for specifically is walkways of a city bridge or city park. You don't need a permit. Tripod on the sidewalk, fine. Although everybody interpret this for yourself. I'm not a lawyer. If you need a permit in New York, it's a $300 non-refundable application fee. There's no fee for the permit itself, but there's a fee for the application. You need insurance. There's a lot of stuff you have to do. But if you're going to put a light on the sidewalk or have a big crew, or $300, it's a lot of money. It's not a lot of money. It just depends. It's fairly easy to do, but you would want to look at it. You can also get a letter in lieu of an optional permit, which is basically a letter saying there is no permit required. You're fine. That's New York City. There are things in New York City, like if you're doing a park, you have to go through the park as well and get permission from the park manager. There are places in New York that get more complicated, like Bryant Park or Central Park or Prospect Park, that feel like city property and kind of are, but they're not managed by the city directly. So Central Park, you have to go through the Central Park Conservancy. Prospect Park, you have to go through the Prospect Park Conservancy. It can get a little complicated. If you're in somewhere like LA, it's even worse because you can't tell what city property, county property, state property. There's this little municipality that this side of the street's one thing is West Hollywood and the other side is Los Angeles. It can get convoluted. Sometimes that's to your benefit. The shoot I mentioned in LA where I got shut down, I sort of got shut down. I was very nice to the person explaining why it wasn't commercial and just being very polite. And he said, well, right here is county property, but if you go over there 20 feet, that's state property, and the state property is not my problem. So we just moved 20 feet, everything looked the same. So always be polite, even if they're wrong. Maybe you're looking at something like National Park land, the Gateway National Rec Area. It's administered by the National Parks in New York, in the New York, New Jersey area. It also has rules about when a permit is needed. Again, verify all of this. And this is specific to still photography. Video and motion, totally different animal. If you're taking pictures in a place where you're generally allowed to be, you're not using things that wouldn't normally be there, you're fine. So if you're using models, it basically says you need a permit. If you're blocking sidewalks, if you're using lights, if you're using props, if you're just there taking pictures, you don't. If you're taking a picture of your friend, who knows? But the permits aren't that expensive. It's more the time frame. A permit is 1 to 10 people in the Gateway National Rec Area, $50 a day. That's quite reasonable. So again, this is the specifics of when and why you might need a model. This generally applies to most national park things, but always check that specific one. And of course, if you're just not sure, just type in something. So Grand Central photo permit. Grand Central is owned by the MTA in New York. So they have their own still photography and film permit application where you fill it out online, send it to them. They give you a thumbs up or a thumbs down. In my limited experience, they're actually quite cooperative. I took a class that I was teaching at a university there. We had 15 students. No, I had 25 students. And all they had me do is break them up into 4 groups. So it was smaller groups, and we had specific spots we could photograph. They didn't charge me anything, but I did get permission. And you need to look at the lead time on everything. There are places that it's a few days. There are places it's a week or two. There are places that want 30 or 60 days. That can get quite complicated when you need a 60-day window to do a permit, because who knows that far out? But it is what it is. The MTA gets very complicated if you want to be on a subway or on a platform. It gets very expensive. Generally, you probably just don't want to, but maybe you do. Los Angeles varies depending on parks. In LA, there's a website called Film LA. That's where you basically go for everything. Even little towns. So my hometown in Washington State, the Port has a website for photography and film requests. It didn't occur to me that the Port of Bellingham would get so many requests that it would merit having a website to talk about it, but they do. Washington State Parks, also home, anywhere you look, just Google that place and photo permit. If you can't find photo permit, you can try film permit, but sometimes they get confused and think that just because you want to take a portrait of someone, you're filming a movie, and it gets clunky. But try things and see. All right, so you're figuring all that. Now you need some gear. You're going to take a picture. It's hard to do that without, at the very least, a camera. When you're on location, there's a lot more flexibility with what you might want to bring. Maybe you want something with a high ISO. We talked about the Sony Alpha 7R2, which was the mirrorless camera that switched me to full-time mirrorless. Now I use the Alpha 7R5 and the Alpha 1 mainly, but something like the Alpha 7S3, very good with high ISOs. Maybe you need something more robust. Maybe you need fast autofocus. There's a lot of options out there. You also want to think about your lenses. Is the space you're in going to be tiny? Do you need wide angle lenses? Are you going to have tons of reach? You want a really long lens? Do you need something that's got a lot of flexibility like the 2470 GM2? You just want to think about what you need and make sure you're covered. You don't want to be in a situation where you don't have a wide enough lens. You also don't want to be in a situation where you're really far and you don't have a long enough lens. You may or may not need to bring a bunch of lenses, but you want to think about what that might be. You know, something like the new 50-1.4 GM, fast aperture, 200 to 600. I actually like that lens for portraits. So think about that. Think about what lighting you may want to bring. I know a lot of people like to use available light, and I do too sometimes. But if you have to take a portrait on this day at this time and the light is bad, you need to have something that can solve that problem for you. So it could be as simple as speed lights. I think Sony speed lights in particular are great on location because they're tiny. So you can put them everywhere and you don't need to worry necessarily about seeing them, or light stands. The 46 RM and the 60 RM2 I use all the time. Really great speed lights. If you're going to use bigger strobes, there's a lot out there. I use ProPhoto, but use what works for you. I would encourage you to get something battery powered though. Don't get something you have to plug into the wall because you may not have outlets. I've been in plenty of places where there was one outlet 50 feet away, and if I had to plug everything in, that's a problem. I did a portrait of somebody in their new condo that was being renovated and there was no power at all. If I had not had battery powered lights, I would have had no lights. So think about what you want. Maybe a reflector or a diffuser. I'm a big fan of both. And then this list is basically the same as it was for the studio list. Extra cards, extra batteries. Do you want a computer to tether? Do you light stands, tripod, lights, extension cord, speaker for music, sandbags. Sandbags are heavy bags, usually 15 or 20 pounds, that you can put on a light stand or a C-stand to help it not fall over. If you're using lights outside, you really, 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 really want to put some weight on there because it's easy for those to blow over. When I was assisting years ago, I was working with a photographer. We had an umbrella on a light outside. I'm like, I think the umbrella is going to be a problem. He said it'll be fine. I was holding onto the light stand, so the light didn't blow over, but the umbrella blew off the light stand into the middle of the street. Fortunately, it didn't hit anybody or anything, but you want to make sure everything's locked down. Wind can come up out of nowhere and just wreck everything. I mean, worst case is it hits a person or a car or something. But it could, even if it doesn't do that, you could wreck your light, and you don't want to do that either. Certainly you don't want to hurt somebody most, but extra cards. I mentioned this before, just make sure when you buy cards that you get the cards that are appropriate for your camera. I see all the time on Facebook people posting they just bought whatever card and it doesn't fit in their camera, and it's because they weren't paying attention. So Sony cameras, the newer ones, take Compact Flash Express Type A. That's mostly the cards I buy now. They also take SD, but you might get confused because Sony makes XQD cards and Compact Express Type B cards. Those don't fit in Sony mirrorless cameras. Music, if you're somewhere where it's appropriate, if you're outside, maybe not. You don't want to annoy other people around you, but if you've rented a location, I'm a big fan of the XE300 and the XB13. I have like 5 XB13s and one in every camera bag. And then if it's a bigger location, I use the XE300. And I mentioned this last time only because I love it. The Sony Walkman high-res digital audio players are super cool. They have 32 gig or 16 gigs of onboard memory, but you can put a micro SD card in there, and you hook this up to your Bluetooth speaker, and when your phone rings, it doesn't go through the speaker, and you can have a conversation without turning off the music. All right, so let's talk about lighting. Start with available light. Available light can be beautiful. I'm a big fan of finding places where there's a little bit of an overhang and just playing with that. So this is the same spot, just rotating the angle a little, finding some shade. So this is on a hill in LA. I put him in the shade from the trees. You can see the highlights from the sun in front of him and behind him. But because he's in the shade, the light's softer and more even. Just maybe adjust the angle that your subject is facing into the light. Get that golden hour light, right before sunset. This is in Central Park by Bethesda, on Bethesda Terrace, just under the overhang again. If you can get an overhang so the light comes in from the side, you can get beautiful light. Reflector, silver reflector outside to help fill in what would have been a very, 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 very contrasty scene. Sometimes just using the lights that are there. This is in Times Square at night. Find something big like this and use the lights from that. Prospect Park, available light. In a situation like this would have been really difficult to light. I mean, if I was going to light it, I would put the camera on a tripod, put the light over there, taken a bunch of pictures, moved the light, shot a plate without the light, composited them together. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Or just find some nice light and do a nice big scene. Shooting straight down, the light's almost always nice when it's cloudy. Just a little bit into open shade. Sometimes when there's a lot going on and a lot of activity, take advantage of that activity and you can do cool things. This is a portrait I did of an actor in Manhattan. There's a lot of people on the sidewalk. So I just use that motion. And this is where the in-body image stabilization that the Sony cameras have, the optical steady shot, can be helpful, because I was hand holding it at a long enough shutter speed to get that blur from everybody moving. But because she's not moving and I'm holding the camera steady with the steady shot, she's still sharp. All right, so we've done available light, the one that everybody wants to do. We can add light, so speed lights. I mentioned those being really useful. One advantage of speed lights as well is that because they're light, you can just clamp them to anything. Because in New York, you need a permit to put a light on the ground, I sometimes attach the light to things that aren't the ground. Is that technically correct? Probably not, but I'm going to argue that I was following the rules. And a little bit of kick makes a big difference. 3 speed lights here. Also, if you're in a situation that is dark enough or shaded or shadowy enough, even something like the Light in Motion CLX8 here with a little softbox can make a big difference. It's going to be limiting if you're in the sun, because while it's bright, it's nowhere near as bright as the sun. But it can be really useful outside. This is 2 1x1 LEDs. This was for a project where I was shooting both video and stills, and I didn't want to light it twice. So I lit everything with the LEDs so I could do the video and then the stills. This is in a hotel in Manhattan. And then sometimes you think that you're going to like the available light and you don't. So the picture on the left is just the window light coming in, which I thought was going to be beautiful, but I didn't love how it looked. Like it's fine, but not great. So I instead lit it from the right, and I'm much happier with the picture on the right. So there are times when you think available light looks good, but then you're not happy with it. A little strobe outside. This is also where strobe can be really, really useful. So this is Hunter on a swing. To get that blue sky, the exposure has to be quite dark. If I made everything brighter, the sky goes white. But if I just add a little strobe, exposure looks good, everything looks good. Photographing the mayor of New Haven, a little bit of strobe outside. Mayor of DC, a little bit of strobe inside. You can see I'm a big fan of strobes. There's also situations like this where even though you have strobe, the sun is so harsh that you can't get enough power. So here I have a softbox on the right. I have an assistant holding a scrim on the left. So we're diffusing the light hitting the subject. You can see the shadow on the sidewalk. And what that does is it removes some of that harsh light, and then just zoom in and remove it in post. Same thing here. Same thing here. Here the camera's on a tripod because I needed the width, and the only place that my assistant could stand was in the frame. So locking the camera on a tripod, I can then just do a picture without her and composite in Photoshop. And if you're locked on a tripod, it's a super easy composite and it looks good. Little bit of strobe, a little bit of strobe mixed with the ambient light. Here I've got a softbox way over to the right. You can see the shadow being cast onto the wall behind her. Because even though it's a big softbox, it's far enough away that it's casting a shadow, because otherwise it would be in the frame. And if I can avoid removing things in Photoshop, I will. But here we get the balance of the strobe, allowing the city to show up. If I had not lit it with strobe, she goes too dark or the city goes too bright. Let's see, we have another question. What is the name of the stand you use clamped onto the gates? I used a super clamp to hold a magic arm. So a Manfrotto super clamp and Manfrotto magic arm, and then the speed light is on the magic arm. Magic arms are really useful because they just have a lever, so you adjust them however you need, and then you just turn the lever and everything locks. Some strobe out in Idaho. Another situation where the sun was a little bit too harsh. It was going in and out where it was getting a little bit of diffusion on clouds. So you just wait till there's a little bit of diffusion on clouds, put the strobe in, light looks beautiful. Same thing. Oregon, upstate New York, nice big softbox. I'm a big fan of softboxes. Softbox, and she's a writer. I photographed for Poets and Writers magazine. This is in her home. No, this is not in her home. This is in a friend of hers home. And just using the light a little bit from the side. When I lit it more frontal, I really wasn't happy with it. Moving it around to the side so the shadow side is towards us. It's called short lighting. Made it much more interesting. Softbox outside. Again, big fan of softboxes outside, but just make sure that they're locked down. Always have them locked down. All right. We answered some questions as they came up. I know I go through a lot and then I go through fast. But let's see if there are any other questions. While we're waiting for that, if you're curious about me or the Sony stuff that I talked about, all that stuff is here. The Sony Alpha Photographers podcast is sort of on hiatus. I'm waiting, giving it a little bit of a break. I did 200 and something episodes, and now it's time for a little bit of a break. Let's see. Anybody else? Any other questions? Hopefully people are coming up with some nice fun plans for summer. Go take some pictures somewhere, do something cool. Let's see. All right, I'm not seeing any questions. Let's see. Oh, nope, I got one. What softbox are you using outdoors? So I use different ones. I have 5-foot Octabanks of various brands that I like a lot. I'm a big fan of the Octabank, so it's a round highlight in the eyes instead of square, rectangular. I have Profoto ones. I have, boy, I don't even know all the brands. Old Broncolor ones that they don't, old Broncolor ones, old Bones ones. I use some umbrellas with diffusion, the Profoto deep umbrellas with diffusion, but outdoors I like, for the same reason I mentioned before, I don't usually use umbrellas because they can blow off the stands. But a 5-foot Octa, almost any brand. Somebody on Zoom, what is your favorite focal length for portraits? It depends on the portrait. If it's a tight portrait, I like long, like 135 or 200. I'm a big fan of the 135 G Master. If it's an environmental portrait, I always thought I didn't have an opinion, and then I looked at all my metadata and realized that I do 35 for indoor environmental portraits a lot. But it depends on the type of portrait and what I'm doing. There's a lot of good answers out there. It just depends on what you like. If that didn't answer either of your questions, feel free to ask again and we'll see what we can do. Marta on Vimeo, what's your go-to light? The one that you feel is most versatile overall? Right now it's either the Sony Speedlight, the 60RM2, or if I need more power, I've been using the ProPhoto B10X Pro, which is a 500-watt monolight that packs up quite small. I think both of those are very, very versatile. It just depends on how much you want to carry, how much power you need, how much money you want to spend. But I think you can't go wrong with either of those, depending on what you need. Steve Thomas asks, I shoot a lot of portraits. Do you keep a list of poses to use? You know, I bought a book on posing that I haven't opened. I think that can be useful. It depends on what kind of portraits you're doing. Most of the time when I'm doing portraits, I'm trying to capture the person, and I'm not usually directing them into a specific pose. I'm just talking to them and waiting until I see something and then photographing that moment, although I shoot a ton because of that. Only because it's if you direct people too much, they're not always comfortable. On the other hand, I've seen people that direct like crazy and get great pictures, so it just depends. But I do not have a list of poses that I keep with me. Sonia asked, what do you think of Godox speedlights? I've never used Godox speedlights, so I can't say. I know that they're inexpensive. I believe one limiter with Godox, but maybe I'm wrong, is that it's not always possible to get things repaired if something goes wrong. But I don't have a real opinion on them because I haven't used the Godox speedlights. Any tips for shooting a senior prom portrait? They're probably the person or persons are probably going to be nervous. So do anything you can to make them easy, put them at ease, make them relaxed. Which is easier said than done, but you know, they're gonna be dressed up fancy. They should feel good. Make them feel good. Just make them feel relaxed, and then put them somewhere that the background isn't distracting. So if you're at the prom, maybe there's something there, but if it's at the house, then, you know, don't put them in front of the tree that doesn't have leaves or whatever. Find somewhere where either the background can be out of focus and not distracting, or where it adds something. I don't know if that's helpful. I've never photographed a senior prom portrait, but hopefully that's helpful. Bruce Korb says, Godox is not as accurate, but they're generally good enough unless you're a perfectionist. So hopefully that answers your Godox question. I am a little bit of a perfectionist in that I want both my color and output to be as accurate as possible and as consistent as possible. So if they're not as accurate, for me, that is a little worrying, because if I shoot, say, 600 pictures of something, I want to be able to adjust all of them at once and not go in and every third or fourth picture is a little brighter or a little darker, or the color's a little off. For me, that's not something that I am willing to do, but everybody shoots differently. If you're only going to have one picture and you're going to shoot 50 and you only need one, maybe that's fine. People use them, other people don't. You know, obviously I like Sony cameras the best. I think for most people they are the right answer, but other people use different brands too. There's no one thing is right for everybody. So maybe try them if you're interested, or ask some more people, watch some YouTube videos, see what you think. Marta on Vimeo, I'm shooting tomorrow and I'm looking for an ethereal look. It's on the beach. Any lighting tips? Marta, some of that's going to depend on what time of day you're shooting. If you can shoot either early or late, that would be helpful. I think the middle of the day is going to be tough. If you have a strobe and you're allowed to bring it, I would definitely bring it. If not, as much as possible, I would try and backlight the person so that you get the edge light and the shadow side is facing you. And then you can make it a little bit more overexposed, and that sometimes makes it feel a little ethereal. But it's going to depend on the weather and what time of day. But hopefully that's helpful. Backlighting can, I think, backlighting and overexposing a little bit. Definitely shoot raw if you can, so that you've got the flexibility, because if you overexpose a JPEG and then you went too far, you could be in trouble. All right, any other questions? I hope all of that was helpful. If it wasn't, well, you didn't have to pay for this. How might winding trails, HOA, how might you shoot a portrait at a volcano at night? Thinking about the Kilauea Caldera Volcanoes National Park on the Big Island. Caldera would be very bright and behind the person. First of all, that sounds awesome. If you can do that. When I was in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, you couldn't go to the caldera because there were fumes and they weren't letting people go. My inclination, if you can get just an LED and bring that so that you can dial it up and down. The caldera is going to be bright, but probably not as bright as you think. But I could be wrong, not having done it. But I think if you just bring an LED, that's probably enough. Not a tiny one, but something that's big enough to be a little bit soft. Or a speed light with an umbrella that you can just hold or have someone hold and put on a little light stand. But find the exposure for the caldera first, both your shutter speed and your f-stop, and then add in whatever light you have to get the correct exposure to the person based on how bright that is in the background. Sonia says, thank you for all the great info. You're welcome. Somebody on Zoom says, thank you, Tony. You're welcome. Hopefully all this is helpful. All right, any other questions? If there aren't, I'm just going to let everybody go about their day and do something cool with the afternoon. Should I get continuous lights for portraits? That depends. Continuous lights for portraits can be fine. If you're going to be shooting outside a lot, I would look at strobes over continuous lights. If you're going to be inside, continuous lights are probably fine. If you're going to shoot video and stills, continuous lights are a good answer, but there's no one right answer. I use both continuous lights and strobes. It just depends on the situation. Continuous lights are certainly easier to get used to, though, and understand, because you can see exactly what they're doing. Whereas a strobe, you have to do a test and see. Winding trails, thanks, Tony, for the class and the tip. You're very welcome. Hopefully it's helpful. I hope you get something awesome. All right. Looks like nothing else is coming in. Oh, you're welcome. Another thank you. I appreciate that. All right, we're about to wrap it up. Any last questions? If not, I'll see you guys at the next one. You are welcome to reach out to me with questions too. If you do via email and I don't get back to you, or Instagram, just reach out again after a couple of weeks. If I'm busy, I get distracted, and then I remember somebody emailed me 2 weeks ago and I can't find the email anymore. All right. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.